The Last Caretaker. Chapter 1. Greenmount's Guardian. The morning fog clung to the tombstones like shrouds, as James Wilson made his way through the eastern section of Greenmount Cemetery. At 76, his steps weren't as steady as they once were, but his hands remained remarkably nimble as he trimmed the grass around a weathered marble headstone from 1889. The stone belonged to Margaret Callahan, who had died in childbirth at the age of 22. James knew this not from reading the inscription, which had faded decades ago, but because he had been tending to Margaret's grave for over 50 years. "Good morning, Margaret," James murmured, his voice rough from years of solitude. "Beautiful day coming once this fog burns off." James had conversation with many of Greenmount's residents, not because he believed they could hear him, though he wasn't entirely convinced they couldn't, but because someone ought to remember them. In a cemetery containing over 15,000 graves, some dating back to 1842, many had no living relatives to visit anymore. James considered himself the keeper not just of the grounds, but of their memories. A 5-generation tradition rested on his stooped shoulders. His great-great-grandfather had been hired as Greenmount's first caretaker when the cemetery was established by the township. The position had passed from father to son without interruption until James, whose only child, a daughter named Sarah, had moved across the country 20 years ago. With no heir apparent, James knew he represented the end of his family's legacy. The thought weighed on him more heavily than his years. The small stone cottage near the cemetery's entrance had been his home since birth. He had grown up watching his father tend the grounds, learning the proper way to maintain monuments without causing damage, how to keep the grass lush but trimmed, and most importantly, how to show respect to the dead and compassion to the grieving. James straightened slowly, wincing as his back protested. He glanced at his watch, nearly 8 o'clock. Mayor Patterson and the developers would be arriving soon for their meeting. He sighed, gathering his tools and making his way back toward the cottage. As he walked, he inspected the grounds with a critical eye, noting with satisfaction the immaculate condition of his domain. Despite the city council's claims that he was too old to properly maintain the cemetery, Greenmount had never looked better. He had just put on a pot of coffee when the crunch of tires on gravel announced visitors. Through the cottage window, James watched a gleaming black SUV pull up beside his weathered pickup truck. Mayor Patterson emerged first, her pantsuit impeccably pressed, and her smile politically calculated. Behind her came 2 men in expensive suits, whom James recognized from the town council meeting last month, representatives from Northside Development Corporation. James stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. "Mayor," he nodded, deliberately ignoring her companions. "James," she replied with practiced warmth. "Beautiful morning. The cemetery looks lovely as always." James grunted noncommittally. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." The taller developer, Parker or Palmer, James couldn't recall, spoke up. "Actually, Mr. Wilson, we're on a tight schedule. Perhaps we could get right to business." James gestured toward the porch swing and 2 rocking chairs. "Suit yourself." Once settled, Mayor Patterson launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech. "James, as you know, Milestone Township is facing significant budget constraints. The annual upkeep for Greenmount costs the taxpayers nearly $150,000, which includes my salary of $32,000, James interjected dryly. "Hardly breaking the bank." The second developer cleared his throat. "Mr. Wilson, Northside Development Corporation is prepared to offer a solution that benefits everyone. Our proposal to relocate the less historically significant sections of the cemetery would free up 12 acres of prime real estate for commercial development." "Relocate," James repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. You mean dig up people's remains and move them to make way for what? Another strip mall. A mixed-use development, the man corrected smoothly. Retail, office space, and luxury condominiums. The property taxes alone would generate over $2 annually for the township. Mayor Patterson leaned forward. James, be reasonable. We're only talking about the newer sections, post-1950. All historically significant graves would remain untouched, and the township would establish a dedicated fund for the perpetual care of the remaining cemetery grounds. And what about me? James asked, though he already knew the answer. The mayor looked uncomfortable. Of course, you'd receive a generous retirement package, and Northside has agreed to preserve the cottage as a historical landmark. James said nothing for a long moment, watching a pair of cardinals flit between the oak trees that lined the cemetery's main path. Finally, he stood. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to come out here and tell me how you plan to desecrate 15,000 graves. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. Mr. Wilson, the taller developer began, but James cut him off. I've been maintaining this cemetery since before you were born, son. These aren't just plots of land with bodies in them. They're people. They had lives, families, hopes, and dreams. They deserve respect. His voice grew firmer. As long as I'm caretaker of Greenmount, not a single grave will be disturbed. Mayor Patterson sighed. James, I understand your attachment, but this isn't solely your decision. The township owns the cemetery. Then I suggest you check the original land grant, James replied evenly. My great-great-grandfather donated this land to the township on the condition it remain a cemetery in perpetuity. There's a clause that requires unanimous approval from the cemetery board for any significant changes. He smiled thinly. And as the only remaining board member, I don't approve. The developers exchanged glances. The mayor looked genuinely surprised. I wasn't aware of such a clause. Our legal team will need to review this. You do that, James said, already turning away. Now, if you don't mind, Mrs. Abernathy's family is coming to visit her grave this afternoon, and I need to make sure her section is properly tended. As the visitors reluctantly returned to their vehicle, James felt a small ripple of satisfaction. He had bought some time, but he knew this fight was far from over. The developers wouldn't give up easily, not with millions of dollars at stake. He returned to his tools, comforted by their familiar weight in his hands. As he worked, he couldn't help but wonder how much longer he could protect Greenmount. His health was failing, though he hid it well, and he had no successor. For the first time in 5 generations, the Wilson family line of caretakers would end with him, unless he could find another way to preserve his family's legacy and the sanctity of the 15,000 souls under his care. Chapter 2. An Unexpected Ally. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Greenmount as James methodically polished the brass plaque on the veteran's memorial. His hands moved in practiced circles, bringing a warm luster to the metal that listed the names of local soldiers lost in conflicts from the Civil War through Vietnam. His father had added this memorial in 1975, and James had maintained it with particular devotion. The sound of footsteps crunching on gravel pulled his attention away from his work. A young man in clerical attire was making his way up the path, pausing occasionally to study the gravestones. James didn't recognize him, which was unusual. After 50 years as caretaker, James knew most of the clergy who conducted services at Greenmount. "Good afternoon," the young man called, raising a hand in greeting. "Beautiful cemetery you have here." James nodded, setting aside his polishing cloth. "Thank you. Can I help you find someone?" "Actually, I was hoping to meet you." The man extended his hand. "I'm Father Michael Reeves, just transferred to St. Augustine's last month." "James Wilson," he replied, shaking the priest's hand. "Caretaker." "I know who you are, Mr. Wilson. Your reputation precedes you." Father Michael smiled warmly. "The other clergy speak highly of your dedication to Greenmount." James grunted noncommittally but felt a flicker of pride. "St. Augustine's, you said. That's Catholic, isn't it? Most of the north section is your parishioners." "Yes, I've been studying the parish records. We've been conducting burials here since 1898. The priest glanced around appreciatively. "I actually wanted to discuss something with you, if you have a moment." James gestured toward a nearby bench beneath a sprawling oak. Once settled, Father Michael got straight to the point. "I understand there's a development company looking to repurpose parts of Greenmount." James's expression hardened. "News travels fast." "Small towns," Father Michael shrugged. "I wanted you to know that the diocese opposes any such action. We consider the graves of our parishioners to be sacred ground." "That right?" James studied the young priest with newfound interest. He couldn't be older than 35, with earnest eyes and the kind of idealism that usually didn't survive long in the real world. "And what does the diocese plan to do about it?" "Our lawyers are reviewing the situation," Father Michael replied. "But I wanted to meet with you personally. I believe your family has been caring for this cemetery for generations." James nodded. "5 generations. My great-great-grandfather established Greenmount in 1842. "That's extraordinary," the priest said, genuine admiration in his voice. "Such a legacy is increasingly rare in our transient society." "And ending with me," James added quietly. "My daughter moved to Seattle years ago, no interest in cemetery work." Father Michael was silent for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Mr. Wilson, I don't mean to pry, but have you considered what will happen to Greenmount after?" "Well, after I die," James finished bluntly. "Every day, the township wants to bring in a maintenance company. Minimum wage workers who won't know Margaret Callahan from Mary Smith." He shook his head. "They won't care about the people beneath the stones." "That's what makes your work so valuable," Father Michael said. "You preserve not just the grounds, but the dignity and memory of those interred here." James studied the young priest, trying to determine if his earnestness was genuine. In his experience, most people found his attachment to the cemetery and its residents peculiar at best, morbid at worst. "Why do you care about this?" he asked finally. "You're new here. These aren't your parishioners in the ground." "But they are," Father Michael countered. "The communion of saints doesn't end with death, Mr. Wilson. Every soul buried here remains part of our spiritual family." He gestured to the graves surrounding them. "Besides, I see how meticulously you care for this place. That kind of devotion is sacred in its own right." Before James could respond, the distant sound of another vehicle approaching caught his attention. A sleek silver car pulled up near his cottage. A woman in a business suit emerged, carrying a leather portfolio. "Looks like the mayor sent her attorney," James muttered, rising from the bench with a sigh. "Would you like me to stay?" Father Michael offered. James considered for a moment, then nodded. "Might be good to have a witness. They think they can steamroll an old man." As they walked toward the cottage, James felt an unexpected sense of relief. He had been fighting this battle alone, assuming no one else cared about the fate of Greenmount's residents. Perhaps he had been wrong. The attorney introduced herself as Diane Winters, representing the township. Her manner was professional but less dismissive than the developers had been. Once they were seated in James's small living room, she opened her portfolio. "Mr. Wilson, I've reviewed the original land grant for Greenmount Cemetery," she began. "You were correct about the cemetery board clause. However," she extracted a document, "the Township Council passed a resolution in 1973 dissolving the independent board and bringing the cemetery fully under township control." James frowned. "That's not possible. My father would never have agreed to that." "According to the minutes, your father was ill during that meeting. The vote proceeded without him." Father Michael leaned forward. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the document. Diane hesitated, then passed it to him. He studied it briefly. This resolution specifically states it applies to administrative and financial oversight. It doesn't override the perpetuity clause in the original land grant. Diane's expression tightened slightly. The township's position is that the resolution grants full authority over the property. Your position is convenient but legally questionable, Father Michael replied mildly. The Catholic Diocese of Harrisburg would certainly contest any attempt to relocate our parishioners' remains, as would the Episcopal Church, James added, seeing an opening, and the Presbyterian congregation, not to mention the Jewish section in the northwest corner. Diane made a note in her portfolio. Religious objections will be taken into consideration, but ultimately, this is a matter of public interest. The development would bring significant economic benefits to Milestone Township, at the cost of desecrating thousands of graves, James retorted. People who can no longer speak for themselves. "Mr. Wilson," Diane said, her tone softening, "I understand your attachment to Greenmount, but you must understand the township's position. The maintenance costs continue to rise, while burial rates have declined significantly. This isn't financially sustainable, because people are choosing cremation more often," Father Michael interjected. "Has the township considered adapting? Perhaps creating a columbarium or memorial garden for urns?" Diane looked surprised. "I don't believe those options have been explored." "What about historical designation?" James asked suddenly. "Greenmount is one of the oldest continuously operated cemeteries in the state." "That would complicate development plans," Diane admitted. "And generate tourism," Father Michael added. "Many historical cemeteries become cultural landmarks, with proper marketing and perhaps guided tour of the oldest sections." James shot the priest a grateful look, seeing the attorney's expression shift from dismissive to contemplative. "I'll bring these alternatives to the council," Diane said finally, gathering her documents. "But I should warn you, Northside Development is prepared to offer substantial incentives to the township. They're quite determined." After she left, James turned to Father Michael with newfound respect. "You handled that well. Where'd you learn to talk like a lawyer?" The young priest smiled. 3 years working in the diocesan office before I requested a parish assignment, mostly property disputes and insurance claims." His expression grew serious. "They'll be back, Mr. Wilson, with a better prepared argument." "James," he corrected. "And yes, I know they will." He gazed out the window at the cemetery stretching before them, the late afternoon sun gilding the tombstones. "But now I know I'm not fighting alone." Father Michael followed his gaze. "Far from it. I'll speak with the other religious leaders in town. Together, we might form a more effective opposition." "I'd appreciate that," James said quietly. "I've been doing this job for 50 years. Never thought I'd need to defend the dead from the living." As Father Michael prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Would you be willing to show me around sometime? I'd like to learn more about Greenmount's history." James felt a strange lightness in his chest, something he recognized after a moment as hope. "Tomorrow morning, I start my rounds at 7. "I'll be here," the priest promised. After Father Michael left, James returned to the Veterans Memorial to finish his polishing. As he worked, he found himself wondering if perhaps there might be a way to preserve Greenmount after all, not through another Wilson, but through others who understood the sacred nature of his work. Chapter 3: The History Beneath. True to his word, Father Michael arrived at Greenmount Cemetery promptly at 7 the next morning. James was already at work, carefully removing fallen leaves from a row of stones in the oldest section. The priest carried 2 coffee cups and a paper bag that emitted the enticing aroma of fresh pastries. "Thought you might appreciate breakfast," he said, offering one of the cups to James. Black, right. James accepted the coffee with surprise. How'd you know? Mrs. Hargrove at the bakery said you've taken your coffee the same way for 40 years. Small towns, James muttered, echoing the priest's words from yesterday. But he took a grateful sip, appreciating the strong brew. They walked together through the morning mist that still clung to the lower sections of the cemetery. James pointed out notable graves and shared stories about milestones past citizens. The town founder whose elaborate obelisk dominated the central pathway. The local Civil War hero whose modest stone belied his significance. The beloved schoolteacher whose funeral in 1932 had been attended by over 500 former students. Your knowledge is remarkable, Father Michael commented as they paused by an angel statue with worn features. Like a living history book. My father made me memorize the stories, James replied. Said a caretaker needs to remember the people, not just maintain the stones. He ran weathered fingers over the statue's base. This is Sophia Winters, died 1894. Taught herself medicine from her physician husband's books and treated the town during the influenza outbreak of 1890. Saved dozens of lives. And the township wants to pave over this history for condominiums, Father Michael said quietly. James shook his head. Not all of it, just the less historically significant sections. His voice took on a bitter edge, as if some deaths matter less than others. They continued their tour, eventually reaching a small plot surrounded by a wrought iron fence. Inside stood a cluster of well-maintained headstones bearing the Wilson name. Your family? Father Michael asked. James nodded. 5 generations of cemetery caretakers. He pointed to each stone in turn, reciting names and dates with reverence. My father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather. My mother's here too, and my wife, Eleanor. His voice softened on the last name. She died young, cancer. I'm sorry, Father Michael said. And your daughter? You mentioned she moved away. Sarah, James's expression grew complicated. She left 20 years ago. Couldn't wait to escape the death business, as she called it. Last I heard, she works for a tech company in Seattle. Has her own family now. He sighed. We don't talk much. Father Michael observed the empty space beside Eleanor's grave, clearly reserved for James himself. It must be difficult, being the last in your family's tradition. More than you know. James turned away from the family plot. Come on, there's something I want to show you. He led the priest to his cottage and opened a door that revealed a narrow staircase descending to a basement. Flicking on a light switch, illuminated a space that looked like a cross between an archive and a museum. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held leather-bound ledgers, carefully preserved documents in protective sleeves, and boxes labeled by decade. Glass display cases contained artifacts, vintage tools, cemetery maps dating back to the 1840s, black and white photographs, even personal items that had been found on the grounds over the years. My God, Father Michael breathed, taking in the collection. This is extraordinary. Wilson Family Archive, James explained, moving to a large oak desk in the center of the room. Every burial recorded by hand, every change to the grounds documented, important events in the town's history. He patted a ledger affectionately. My family's life work. Father Michael moved reverently among the shelves, examining the meticulously organized contents. This must be one of the most comprehensive historical collections in the county. The township doesn't know about most of it, James admitted. They'd probably want to put it in a museum or university archive. Why haven't you shared it? James considered the question. These records are part of my job. The next caretaker would need them. His shoulders slumped slightly. But there won't be a next Wilson caretaker, will there? Father Michael studied the old man's face, seeing the weight of generations pressing down on him. Have you considered donating the collection? with proper recognition of your family's contribution, of course. And admit defeat, James shook his head. Once these records leave this cottage, it's truly over. The Wilson legacy ends. Not necessarily, Father Michael said carefully. These records could be the key to saving Greenmount. James looked up sharply. How do you mean? Historical significance. If we can document the importance of the entire cemetery, not just the oldest sections, we might be able to secure protected status. The priest gestured to the surrounding archives. The story of Milestone Township is buried in Greenmount and preserved in these records. That's a powerful argument against development. For the first time since they'd met, James smiled. It transformed his weathered face, erasing years of solitude and worry. You might be onto something, Father. They spent the next several hours poring over records, James explaining the organization system his ancestors had developed. Each burial was recorded with surprising detail, not just names and dates, but occupations, family connections, causes of death, and often personal anecdotes about the deceased. The Wilson caretakers had been more than groundskeepers. They had been the town's chroniclers. Here, James said suddenly, pulling out a thin folder labeled 1973. The township meeting where they supposedly dissolved the cemetery board. Inside was a newspaper clipping about the council meeting, alongside a handwritten note from James's father. The note detailed his objections to the resolution and his belief that it violated the original land grant. Most importantly, it referenced a letter of protest he had sent to the township supervisor. "Did they ever respond to your father's letter?" Father Michael asked. "Not that I know of," James replied, frowning. "Let me check the correspondence files." After some searching, they found a folder of official letters. There was indeed a response from the township acknowledging receipt of the elder Wilson's protest, but claiming the resolution was legally binding regardless. However, an attached legal opinion from the township's attorney at the time expressed reservation about the resolution's applicability to the perpetuity clause. "This could be significant," Father Michael said, carefully photographing the documents with his phone. "It suggests the township knew they might be overstepping their authority but proceeded anyway." James leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. So they've known for 50 years that their claim to full control might not be valid. It appears so. Father Michael looked thoughtful. "James, with your permission, I'd like to share these findings with a lawyer friend of mine who specializes in historical preservation. He might be able to." He was interrupted by a loud knock at the cottage door upstairs. James glanced at his watch, surprised to see it was already past noon. Who could that be? "I'm not expecting any funerals today." They ascended the stairs to find Mayor Patterson on the porch, accompanied by a different man in a suit, not one of the developers from before. "James," the mayor greeted him, her smile tight. "I hope we're not interrupting. I see you have company." "Father Michael Reeves," the priest introduced himself. "St. Augustine's Parish." The suited man stepped forward. "Richard Harmon, State Historical Commission. The mayor was kind enough to give me a tour of your lovely town, including this cemetery." James exchanged a quick glance with Father Michael, trying to gauge whether this was good news or bad. "What brings the Historical Commission to Greenmount?" "Actually, we received an application for historical designation," Harmon explained. "Quite an impressive one, with extensive documentation of the cemetery's significance to regional history." James frowned in confusion. "I didn't submit any application." "No," Mayor Patterson said, her voice brittle. "It was submitted by the Milestone Historical Society. Apparently, they've been gathering materials for months without informing the township." Father Michael hid a smile. How fortunate. Historical designation would certainly recognize Greenmount's importance to the community. Harmon nodded enthusiastically. Indeed, though I must say the application would be significantly strengthened by primary sources. He looked at James hopefully. I understand your family has maintained record since the cemetery's founding. James felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Hope that Greenmount might be saved, suspicion about the mayor's presence, and protective instinct toward his family's archives. I might have some materials that would be of interest, he said cautiously. Wonderful, Harmon exclaimed. The commission is particularly interested in cemeteries with continuous family stewardship. It's becoming quite rare. Mayor Patterson's smile had completely disappeared. Of course, any historical designation would need to accommodate the township's development plans. Perhaps a compromise designating only the oldest sections. Actually, Father Michael interjected smoothly, we've just discovered documents suggesting the township may not have full authority over the cemetery's disposition. The 1973 resolution had specific limitations that appear to preserve the perpetuity clause in the original land grant. The mayor's face flushed. That's a matter for the township's legal department to determine. Of course, Father Michael agreed pleasantly. I'm sure they'll want to review all the relevant documents, including the legal opinion from your own attorney in 1973. James watched this exchange with growing admiration for the young priest's diplomatic yet firm approach. Perhaps there was hope for Greenmount after all. Yet even as this thought formed, a sharp pain lanced through his chest. He grimaced, pressing a hand against his sternum. Father Michael noticed immediately. James, are you all right? Fine, James muttered, though the pain intensified. Just need to sit down for a moment. But as he moved toward a chair, the room began to spin. The last thing he heard before darkness claimed him was Father Michael calling his name and the mayor shouting for someone to call an ambulance. Chapter 4. Mortal Concerns. The rhythmic beeping of medical equipment greeted James as he drifted back to consciousness. Opening his eyes to the sterile whiteness of a hospital room, he felt a moment of disorientation before the memory of his collapse returned. He tried to sit up, only to be gently restrained by a hand on his shoulder. "Easy there, Mr. Wilson," said a nurse, adjusting his pillows. "Doctor wants you to rest." "How long have I been here?" James asked, his voice rough. "About 6 hours. You had a minor heart attack." She checked his vitals with practiced efficiency. "The doctor will be in shortly to discuss your condition." As the nurse left, James noticed Father Michael sitting in a chair by the window, reading from a small prayer book. The priest looked up, relief washing over his face. "Thank God you're awake. You gave us quite a scare." "Who's taking care of Greenmount?" James asked immediately, attempting again to sit up. Father Michael moved to help him adjust the bed. "The cemetery will survive a day without you, James. Your health is what matters right now." "You don't understand," James insisted. "There's maintenance that can't wait. Mrs. Abernathy's family is being taken care of," Father Michael assured him. "I called the parish groundskeeper. He's handling the essential work, following your weekly schedule that was posted in your cottage." James subsided, though not entirely satisfied. A stranger working his grounds, it was wrong, but he lacked the strength to argue. "What did the doctor say?" "That you're lucky. The heart attack was mild, caught early." Father Michael's expression grew serious. "But he also said it wasn't your first. You've had episodes before, haven't you?" James looked away. "Maybe a couple small ones, nothing serious." "Why didn't you tell anyone? And give the township another reason to force me out?" James shook his head. "I can manage." By collapsing in front of the mayor and a state official, Father Michael's voice was gentle but firm. "James, you can't take care of Greenmount if you don't take care of yourself." Before James could respond, the door opened to admit Dr. Harrison, a woman in her 50s whom James had known for years. "Well, James Wilson," she said, reviewing his chart. "Finally got you in my hospital, only took 3 heart attacks. 3, Father Michael repeated, looking at James with concern. Dr. Harrison raised an eyebrow. You didn't tell your priest friend about your previous visits to the emergency room, or the medication you've been prescribed, but, according to your blood work, haven't been taking regularly. James scowled. Don't you have patient confidentiality? I'm invoking the stubborn old fool clause, she replied dryly. James, I've been telling you for 2 years that you need to reduce your workload. This attack was still relatively minor, but the next one might not be. So what are you saying? James demanded, though he already knew the answer. I'm saying you can't continue working the way you have been. The physical strain is too much for your heart. Her expression softened. I know how much Greenmount means to you, but you need to consider alternatives. Like what? Retiring? Letting the township bring in their minimum wage crews, who don't know one end of a cemetery from the other. Dr. Harrison sighed. I can't answer that, but I can tell you that if you don't make changes, you'll end up as a permanent resident of Greenmount sooner rather than later. After she left, a heavy silence fell over the room. James stared out the window, where he could just make out the distant hills that surrounded Greenmount Cemetery. 5 generations of Wilsons had dedicated their lives to those grounds. How could he be the one to break that chain? She's right, you know, Father Michael said quietly. I know, James admitted, the fight draining out of him. But what options do I have? The township won't fund a full-time replacement. They've been trying to cut costs for years. What about training someone, an apprentice of sorts? James scoffed. Who'd want to learn cemetery maintenance? Young people today want digital jobs, not digging in the dirt and tending to the dead. You might be surprised, Father Michael suggested. There are people who value history, tradition, meaningful work. Even if I found someone, how would they be paid? My salary barely covers my own needs. Father Michael leaned forward. What if the historical designation comes through? That might include grants for preservation, including staff. Maybe, James conceded reluctantly. But that's not guaranteed, and the application process could take months. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. To James's surprise, Richard Harmon from the State Historical Commission entered, carrying a folder and looking somewhat apologetic. Mr. Wilson, I hope I'm not intruding. The hospital staff said you were awake and able to receive visitors. He nodded to Father Michael. Father Reeves, good to see you again. Mr. Harmon, James acknowledged warily. Did you come to finish our conversation about historical designation? Actually, yes. Harmon pulled a chair closer to the bed. After your episode, I took the liberty of speaking with some colleagues at the commission. We're expediting Greenmount's application. James exchanged a surprised look with Father Michael. Why? Frankly, because we're concerned about the development threat. Harmon opened his folder. The commission has been monitoring similar cases across the state. Historical cemeteries facing commercial development pressure. We've established a new rapid response protocol for situations like yours. That's unexpected good news, Father Michael said cautiously. There's more, Harmon continued. I also visited your cottage, hope you don't mind, to get exterior photographs for the application. I happened to meet a young woman there, quite distressed, asking neighbors about your condition. James's heart monitor beeped faster. Young woman. She said she was your daughter, Sarah, I believe. Sarah's here, James's voice faltered. In Milestone. Harmon nodded. She said she flew in this morning, had been planning to surprise you. Instead, she was greeted with news of your hospitalization. James fell silent, processing this information. He hadn't seen his daughter in nearly a decade, their relationship reduced to brief phone calls on holidays and birthdays. That she would come now after all this time. Did she say where she was staying? He finally asked. At your cottage, actually. She had a key. Harmon glanced at his watch. In fact, she mentioned she'd be coming to visit you this afternoon. I should probably go and let you rest before she arrives." "Thank you for expediting the application," Father Michael said, rising to shake Harmon's hand. "It means a great deal." After Harmon left, James stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. Sarah, here in Milestone after all these years. What could have prompted her return? And how would he face her after their last bitter argument, when she'd accused him of loving the dead more than his own family? "Do you want me to leave before she arrives?" Father Michael asked gently. "Give you some privacy for your reunion." James shook his head. "Stay, please." He was surprised by the vulnerability in his own voice. "I don't know what to say to her after all this time." "The truth might be a good start," Father Michael suggested. "About your health, about Greenmount's situation." "She never understood my devotion to the cemetery," James sighed. "Always resented it, especially after her mother died. Said I spent more time with the graves than I did at Alina's bedside." "Was she right?" James was silent for a long moment. "Maybe. I thought I was doing my duty, honoring my family legacy while providing for my family. But Sarah saw it differently, said I was hiding among the dead because I couldn't face the living." His voice grew hoarse. Maybe she was right about that too. Before Father Michael could respond, there was another knock at the door. It opened to reveal a woman in her early 40s, with James's same gray eyes and determined chin. She stood hesitantly in the doorway, a bouquet of wildflowers clutched in one hand. "Dad," she said simply. "Sarah," James's voice cracked on her name. "You're really here." Father Michael discreetly rose. "I'll give you two some time. James, I'll check back this evening." As the priest slipped out, Sarah took his vacated chair. An awkward silence stretched between father and daughter, 20 years of distance condensed into the small space between them. "You look terrible," Sarah finally said, a ghost of a smile softening the words. "Heart attack will do that to you." James's attempt at humor fell flat. "You look good, professional." Sarah placed the wildflowers on his bedside table. "Picked these on the way, from that field behind Greenmount. Remember how we used to gather them for Mom's birthday?" The memory hit James with unexpected force. Sarah as a little girl, laughing as they waded through summer grass, carefully selecting the perfect blooms for Alina. His vision blurred briefly. "I remember. Mr. Harmon told me about the development plans for the cemetery," Sarah said, changing the subject. "Is that what caused?" She gestured to the hospital room. "Partly. Doc says my heart's been giving warnings for a while." He studied his daughter's face, trying to read her expression. "Why are you here, Sarah, after all this time?" She looked down at her hands. "I got a letter from Father Michael about a month ago. He introduced himself as the new priest at St. Augustine's and mentioned he'd met you. Said he thought I should know about the situation with Greenmount." James raised his eyebrows. "The good father neglected to mention that. He wrote that you were still maintaining the cemetery alone, that your health seemed fragile, and that developers were circling." Sarah met his gaze directly. "He didn't ask me to come, just said he thought I should know what was happening with my family's legacy. And that was enough to bring you back after 20 years." Sarah sighed. "Dad, it's been complicated, you know that. But whatever our differences, I couldn't just ignore what's happening. And," she hesitated, "I've been thinking about the past a lot lately, about Mom, about our family history." James waited, sensing there was more. "My daughter, your granddaughter Emily. She's 14 now. Last semester, her history class did a genealogy project." Sarah smiled faintly. "Em discovered she comes from 5 generations of cemetery caretakers and became completely fascinated. Started researching historical cemeteries, death traditions, gravestone symbolism. She's been begging to visit Greenmount to see where her ancestors worked." "She has." James couldn't hide his surprise or the small flicker of hope in his chest. She reminds me of you, actually. That same intensity when she gets interested in something. Sarah reached into her purse and withdrew a small notebook. She made this. Asked me to give it to you. James accepted the notebook with trembling hands. Opening it revealed careful sketches of tombstones, notes on cemetery layouts, even a family tree tracing the Wilson caretakers back to 1842. The last page held a message. Grandpa James, I can't wait to see Greenmount and learn about our family's work. Love, Emily. She's quite something, Sarah said softly. Smart, curious. Sees beauty in things other kids her age miss entirely. James closed the notebook carefully, overcome with emotion. I didn't know, he managed finally, about her interest, about any of this. I haven't made it easy for you to know her, Sarah acknowledged. That's on me. I was angry for so long about everything. But seeing Emily connect with our family history made me realize I'd been unfair, cutting her off from that heritage. From you. James struggled to find words, decades of regret and longing tangling in his throat. I'm sorry, Sarah, for not being the father you needed, for putting Greenmount first too often. And I'm sorry for not understanding what the cemetery meant to you, she replied. It wasn't just a job, it was your calling. They sat in silence for a moment, the reconciliation tentative but real. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice taking on a more practical tone. So, these developers want to pave over our family legacy for condos, and the township is backing them. Tell me what we're going to do about it. We, James repeated, startled by the determination in her voice. Yes, we. I may have left Milestone, but I'm still a Wilson. Her expression hardened. And no one messes with 5 generations of Wilson work without a fight. For the first time in years, James felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. Perhaps he wasn't the last caretaker after all. Chapter 5, Legacy Renewed. 3 months later, James sat on a bench beneath the great oak tree in Greenmount's oldest section, watching as his granddaughter Emily carefully cleaned lichen from the face of a weathered tombstone. Her methodical work and gentle touch with the soft brush mirrored his own techniques, techniques that had been passed down through 5 generations of Wilson caretakers. Remember to work from the bottom up, he called. Less chance of streaking that way. Emily nodded without looking up, completely absorbed in her task. At 14, she possessed a focus and reverence that reminded James painfully of himself at that age, working alongside his father among these same graves. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and freshly turned earth. In the distance, Sarah and Father Michael were walking the perimeter of the cemetery, deep in conversation as they reviewed plans for the upcoming Halloween historical tour. The event would be the first of many designed to showcase Greenmount's historical significance to the wider community. Much had changed since James's heart attack. The State Historical Commission had granted Greenmount Cemetery preliminary protected status, effectively halting Northside Development's plans. Mayor Patterson, reading the political winds, had pivoted to supporting the cemetery as a cultural treasure, and was now championing a grant application for restoration funds. But the most significant change had come from within James's own family. Sarah had taken a 3-month leave of absence from her Seattle job to help her father recover and address Greenmount's future. What began as a temporary return had evolved into something more permanent. Last week, she had accepted a remote position that would allow her to remain in Milestone indefinitely. Emily's enthusiasm for Greenmount had been immediate and genuine. She had spent every day of her summer vacation following James around the grounds, absorbing his knowledge about monument preservation, grounds maintenance, and the stories behind the graves. She recorded everything in notebooks similar to the one she had sent him, creating her own archive of cemetery lore. "Grandpa," Emily called now, interrupting his thoughts. I think I found something under the lichen. There's a small symbol carved here that's not in your records. James made his way over, moving more slowly these days but with less pain thanks to his properly prescribed medication. He knelt with some difficulty beside his granddaughter. "Well, I'll be," he murmured, examining the revealed carving. A compass rose. This must be Captain Stanley's stone. He was lost at sea in 1896, body never recovered. The family must have added this symbol later. It wasn't noted in the original records. Emily was already sketching the discovery in her notebook. We should update the archive and maybe include it in the tour. Visitors would find it interesting. They would indeed, James agreed, feeling a familiar satisfaction at this small recovery of history. This was what the Wilson caretakers had always done, preserved not just the physical grounds but the stories and symbols that connected the dead to the living. A car pulled up to the cemetery gates, and Richard Harmon emerged with a woman James recognized as the director of the State Historical Commission. Sarah and Father Michael changed direction to greet them. "Looks like the big meeting is about to start," James said, helping Emily gather her cleaning supplies. "Better not keep them waiting." They made their way to the cottage, where James had set up chairs in the living room to accommodate the growing number of people involved in Greenmount's preservation. The Wilson Family Basement Archive, now officially designated as the Greenmount Historical Collection, had been reorganized and partially digitized, with Emily taking charge of the scanning project. As others filed in, the mayor, representatives from local historical societies, even a reporter from the county newspaper, James found himself observing the scene with a sense of wonder. For decades, he had worked in isolation, believing that solitude was the caretaker's lot. Now his cottage hummed with purposeful activity, all focused on securing Greenmount's future. Sarah called the meeting to order, her natural organizational skills making her the obvious choice to lead the Greenmount Preservation Committee that had formed following the historical designation. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "We have several updates to share, starting with the Commission's decision on our grant application." Harmon stood. "I'm pleased to announce that Greenmount Cemetery has been awarded a $250,000 restoration grant to support both physical preservation and historical documentation." He smiled at the resulting applause. The commission was particularly impressed by the Wilson Family Archive and the continuity of care spanning 5 generations. James felt Emily's hand slip into his, squeezing with excitement. "This is a landmark decision," the commission director added. "We're establishing Greenmount as a model for cemetery preservation across the state." The documentation James and his ancestors maintained provides an unparalleled window into local history. Mayor Patterson, ever the politician, took the opportunity to express the township's long-standing commitment to preserving Greenmount, conveniently forgetting her previous support for development. "We're exploring ways to integrate the cemetery into our tourism strategy," she explained. "The economic benefits of heritage tourism are substantial." Father Michael caught James's eye across the room, sharing a private moment of amusement at the mayor's about-face. The young priest had proven to be not just a spiritual ally, but a shrewd advocate, leveraging the combined influence of multiple religious denominations to support Greenmount's preservation. As the meeting continued, James found his attention drifting to the window, where he could see the cemetery stretching out before him. The afternoon sun illuminated the stones, highlighting the careful work of countless Wilson hands over decades. His father had once told him that caretaking was an act of faith, faith that remembrance mattered, that honoring the dead served the living. For the first time in years, that faith felt justified. The commission director's voice pulled him back to the present. "There's one more item we'd like to discuss: the need for a formal succession plan for Greenmount's management. Sarah nodded. We've been considering various options. A board of trustees could provide oversight, with a professional cemetery manager handling day-to-day operations. Actually, the director interjected, the commission strongly favors continuing the Wilson family stewardship model. It's a key part of what makes Greenmount historically significant. All eyes turned to James, who shifted uncomfortably under the attention. I'm not getting any younger, he said bluntly, and my health isn't what it was, which is why we're proposing a formal apprenticeship program, Harmon explained, with grant funding to support training a successor who would work alongside you, learning the specialized skills and knowledge developed by generations of Wilson caretakers. Emily sat up straighter beside James, her eyes bright with interest. We've already identified a promising candidate, Sarah added, glancing meaningfully at her daughter, though she'll need to finish high school first. James turned to Emily in surprise. You'd want that? To become a caretaker? Emily met his gaze steadily. I've been thinking about it since we came here. At first, I just thought the cemetery was interesting, the history, the art on the stones. But working with you these past months, I've realized it's more than that. She gestured toward the window. These aren't just graves. They're people's stories. Their lives mattered, and someone should remember them properly. The room had fallen silent, everyone watching this exchange between the oldest and youngest Wilson generations. It wouldn't be easy, James warned. The work is physically demanding, often solitary, and people don't always understand or value what we do. I know, Emily replied, but it matters. And I'd be continuing something important, not just our family tradition, but a kind of sacred trust. She looked down, suddenly self-conscious. That probably sounds silly. No, James said softly. It doesn't sound silly at all. It's exactly right. After the meeting concluded and the visitors departed, James found himself alone with Sarah, Emily, and Father Michael. They sat on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint Greenmount's monuments in golden light. Are you really okay with Emily considering this path? James asked Sarah quietly. After you worked so hard to escape it. Sarah was silent for a moment. I didn't understand before. I saw only the burden, not the honor. She watched her daughter, who was pointing out different gravestone designs to Father Michael. Emily sees both, and she'll have choices I didn't feel I had. If she ultimately decides this is her calling, I'll support her. And in the meantime, James asked, in the meantime, we have a cemetery to preserve and a legacy to document. Sarah smiled. I've been thinking about writing a book about the Wilson caretakers. 5 generations of cemetery stewardship. It's a story worth telling. I'd like that, James admitted. There's so much I haven't shared, so many stories that might otherwise be lost. Then we'd better get started, Sarah said, while your memory is still sharp. As dusk settled over Greenmount, James felt a deep contentment that had eluded him for years. The burden he had carried alone for so long, the fear of being the last, of failing his ancestors and the souls in his care, had lifted. Whether or not Emily ultimately chose to become Greenmount's next caretaker, the Wilson legacy would continue, transformed but unbroken. Father Michael joined them, Emily at his side. I was just telling Emily about medieval cemetery consecration rituals, he explained. Fascinating traditions. That reminds me, James said, suddenly remembering. Tomorrow is the Andrews funeral. Emily, would you like to help me prepare the site? The girl nodded eagerly. Can I show Father Michael our mapping system first? He's interested in how we track unused plots. Of course, James agreed. Take him to the archive. As the two headed inside, Sarah sat beside her father. You're really going to be okay with all this, aren't you? The committees, the tourism, the changes. James considered the question. For decades, he had resisted any alteration to Greenmount's operation, seeing change as a threat to tradition. But now he understood that adaptation was necessary for survival. "Yes," he said finally, "Greenmount will live on even if it's different, and the dead will still be remembered. That's what matters most." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell, and the first stars appeared above the cemetery. In the distance, the silhouettes of monuments stood like silent sentinels against the night sky. Generations of milestone citizens at eternal rest under the watchful care of the Wilson family. James Wilson might not be the last caretaker after all, and somehow that made all the difference. The end.